for I'm a businessman like you, I want to talk about this challenge of sustaining growth as we hit this demographic cliff, as the Western baby boomers hit this age of 55. And the argument I put forward is really summed up by this phrase of Alexander Graham Bell. Sometimes we stare so long at a door that is closing, we seek too late the one that is open. And that, to me, represents what's been going on for the last 4 years. But the central banks have really been in the wrong place, looking at the wrong problem, and as a result, we're not getting solutions. Essentially, the argument that I'm going to put forward briefly this morning is we see all the time people like Bernanke at the Federal Reserve talking about, oh, the risk of a new depression. We're not in a new depression. This is not the problem that we had. What we had was we had supercharged growth for 25 years, almost continuous growth between 1982 and 2007, as the boomers, this unique group of people, the wealthiest and the largest generation in history, came through and went into demand. Now they're buying less, they're heading towards retirement. That's it. There's nothing, the economy is about people. It's not about computer models or anything else. So this is neither good nor bad. This is just, if you ask me, am I in favour of this? I'll come back to that in a moment, but yes, I am. The ageing boomers, unfortunately, from growth point of view, spend less and save more. Emerging economies, therefore, like China, critically important to metals, therefore can't anymore have an export-focused demand model. So we have to change. Michael Porter, very interesting, the Harvard Business School guru, has independently come up with this concept of we need to change the way we think about business and change the focus in order to get back to growth. And this requires some business model and technical innovation, which is really what I'm going to talk about. So this may seem odd that I'm going to start with these two slides, but these are the two critical slides. Essentially, over the last 100 years, we have seen in the West life expectancy increase from 46 up to 80. So we've almost doubled life expectancy. In the emerging economies, in the red here, they've gone from 26 up to 71, an even bigger increase. So you now have a situation where you have most babies who are going to be born, live on, and they live for longer. As a result, women no longer have to be into childbearing every year. You don't have to have, as you did 100 years ago, 10 or 15 babies in order to make sure that one of them would survive to look after you. Therefore, in every country in the world, more or less, fertility rates have been coming down. So you have increased life expectancy, fewer young people. People talk about a population explosion. This is completely misleading. What we have is a health explosion where people are living very much longer. So as a result of that, we now have two major changes going on. We have a generation of people who are over 55 for the first time in history, and secondly, we have women able to live their own lives. They don't have anymore to be at home having babies all the time. Two quite dramatic, and I would argue, absolutely fantastic changes. Now, if the consequence of that is that we have lower growth, who cares? Would I rather be dead at 50 and we can continue to have growth as we did, or would I rather have an extra 20 years of active life and we have to put up or make do with growth of 0 or perhaps lower? It's such a stupid question, you don't even have to ask the answer. But just to give you some indication, the US here, if we look at the numbers and we take the dates from 1921 through to recently, what we see is that US births rose 52%. This is the wealthiest economy in the world, and in that period, between 46 and 64 in the States, it rose 52%, and then they fell. So as these babies came through, you got this consumption supercycle, and this was happening, as I say, across the Western world. And you got the emerging economies used as an export development model, China coming into the WTO in 2001, for example. But where are we today? The average boomer is now becoming 55, and if we look at their age profile, what we see is they've got the longest life expectancy in history, so they have to save more, because they know that they're very likely to live to 75 or 80, and they haven't actually saved enough money. Our pension funds and so on are not built on the basis of living for 15 or 20 years of pension. They're built for living, if you're lucky, 3 or 4 years. So everything changes in our attitude and in our economies. Where we now are is that 25% already of the US population is in this over 55 group. And this is the official data for the States, and you can see the same data for the UK and for Japan and all other leading countries, which is what we know intuitively. Spending peaks at around the age of 45 to 54. Because the kids are older, you're still paying off the mortgage, you're doing all these things, and then after that, what happens? The kids leave home, you've paid off the mortgage, you start to spend a bit more on leisure and recreation. You say, well, I'm still fit and I've got some cash, I'll go off and do all the trips that I want to do. So spending in certain areas goes up, but overall, as the data shows us, spending actually starts to fall quite significantly. So there is no point in central banks and policymakers trying to promote economic growth because you haven't got the population around to do it. But this doesn't matter. As I say, I would much rather be alive and have lower growth or negative growth than be dead so that everybody else can have fast growth. And anyway, what's good about fast growth? It was only causing environmental problems, as we all know, anyway. So spending at the age of 55 basically becomes replacement level. It's not, when my wife came back from the doctor when we were younger and she said, darling, I'm pregnant, you don't sit around thinking, what do I do next? You get moving because you know you've got 6, 7 months and this baby is going to arrive. Today, if we decide, well, she says, look, I think we might need to get a new sofa or something, there's no urgency about it. If we can afford it, if we see one we like, but maybe we don't. So the whole pattern of spending has changed. It's neither good nor bad, it's just the way it is. Now, this is, people go on about, oh, interest rates are going to go back to normal soon. No, actually, they've come back to normal. If we look at the history of US long bond, what we can see is that it used to average somewhere around 3 to 4%. That was what you could afford. And that was what, if you were running a business, you'd then add a few percent to that, maybe 7 or 8%, to get an adequate return. Now, when all these boomers came through in the 70s and 80s, and there was an excess of demand, and they hadn't got into the workforce, and therefore there was not enough supply, of course, what happened was interest rates went up to record levels. I can show you, if anybody wants, I can show you a Bank of England chart going back to 1703, which gives you exactly the same performance. So, because in our minds we equate normal with the interest rates of when we were young, that is completely misleading. Interest rates are now back where they ought to be and where they always have been. What I can also show you here is I can give you an economic forecast. And it doesn't really matter what Bernanke and King or Carney or any of these people do, this is where we're going to go. Because at the end of the day, it's only people who are going to generate an economy, nothing that these superheroes do. And what I'm showing you here is the blue column here is the growth in what we call the wealth creator cohort, these 25 to 54-year-olds who really bear the brunt of all the wealth creation. They're fit, they're active, they're working like mad, they're building their careers. They are the ones who generate most of the wealth. People before that are studying or just learning their jobs. People after that are beginning to wind down. So you see how that rose and peaked around 1983. You see how the 10-year bond there peaked at exactly the same point because suddenly more supply began to come in and demand growth began to slow. And equally, if we look at US GDP, we see exactly the same pattern happening. And this has happened, we've got the data going back from 1962 to 2012. So I feel pretty confident that we know where this is going and it's going to continue on a downward path. As I say, I don't think this is good or bad, but what it does mean is the West has gone ex-growth because we have this ageing population. This, in turn, means the emerging economies have to refocus on domestic demand. Now, from a company point of view, which is what I'm interested in, what you're interested in, this means that we need to focus on the potential growth sectors. Now, this growth sector of the over 55s is fantastically interesting. It's going to grow 34% over the next 15 years. There's every other cohort is reducing in size in the West, but this group, which is already 272 million people, is going to grow 34%. And absolutely nobody is making any products or services for this group. As far as everybody is concerned, as soon as you get to 55, you go into retirement home, and if you're lucky, you get a Zimmer frame. It's a complete nonsense, completely out of date. philosophy, and the companies that pick up on this and start to move forward will do extremely well. As I said to a number of boards recently, even you gentlemen and ladies can do well because there is no competition. That's the kind of market that most of us like. Equally, there's going to be some very interesting markets in the emerging economies. So just to turn to China at the moment, and where is China here? China is facing an enormous risk, as I think many of us know. For over a year now, the World Bank has been warning that China is in this very difficult position of the middle-income country, where it's grown because of having cheap labour. Now it has to change tack. There's no more cheap labour. Instead, it needs to develop more thinking workforce, and of course a more thinking workforce is one that also wants more of a say in the politics and the running of the country. They won't just accept, okay, we're getting more money, you guys in the Communist Party can stay in power. And the record of countries making this transition is incredibly bad. Japan did it, Korea did it, Argentina, Buenos Aires 100 years ago was a larger, wealthier city than New York. It completely failed to make the transition. So have most countries. So what China is facing today, which they do recognise, is an immense challenge, and one shouldn't be too cavalier about whether this will happen or not. What we do know, I think, is that the last regime, which is retiring this week, of President Hu and Premier Wen, did exactly the wrong things. They got into WTO just as they came to power, and they decided, okay, we're going to short-circuit all this process that normally takes 50 years. We're going to do it in 10 through export-led growth and infrastructure spending. Fantastic for the metals industry, obviously, all that infrastructure. Where does it leave you? I've marked out there 10 years in that yellow band there, and what you can see is that green line, which is infrastructure investment, has gone through the roof. We're up at 45, 46%. We've never seen a country in that position, certainly never an emerging country. So what are you doing? You're building railways to nowhere. Who cares? You don't need them. You haven't got the need for all this infrastructure. And of course it builds tremendous corruption, which is one of the big problems they've got today. Equally, personal consumption has dropped dramatically. Worst in the rural areas, that purple line has dropped now right down to 8% of GDP, and yet it's half of the population. So who and when historians start to write about this period, will not be seen as heroes at all, and the new guys coming in, Xi and Li, have an enormous turnaround job, which they seem to be recognising. But they also have this problem of the incredible housing price bubble. I shot to fame, well, I don't know, shot to fame is the right word, but I certainly got some interest from pointing out in 2006, 2007 in the Financial Times and elsewhere that the subprime bubble was a subprime bubble. And I have no hesitation in saying exactly the same in China, because house price to earnings ratios in China are twice what they were in the US. So this is a very scary position, and this is why, I mean, again, Xi and Li have noticed this, and that's why you saw last week a 20% capital gains tax going on. They are, I think, absolutely determined to burst that bubble. It will cause problems, but if they don't burst it, they're going to have bigger problems ahead. And exports, of course, have already gone. What kind of GDP growth did Hu and Wen put forward? Just to show you one example of anything, this, in 2012, Shenyang blew up a 9-year-old indoor sports stadium, which had cost 126 million and was the largest in Asia when it was built. And why was that done? Because blowing it up and then building another one contributes to meeting your GDP target. This is the madness that the last regime got into. And of course everybody won. You were able to have contracts, so you got corrupt, you got bribes, which you could put into Hong Kong or Macau or Switzerland or whatever you like that. You could equally, you met your target, so you moved up the Communist Party hierarchy. But this is unsustainable. We all know that. And it's very interesting that the new regime has allowed this to be published. This is China Daily, the official daily. This is not some obscure magazine. It's a game some officials like to pay because it boosts local GDP, which has long been a key criteria. So there's some severe questions being asked now in China about how we go forward. Equally, what we do know, and this was highlighted by Ma, the head of the National Statistics Bureau, just before Christmas, because of the one-child policy, which has been in existence since 1978, China's demographics are almost as the same as ours in the West. Within a couple of years, if you look at that, you see that red column in 2010, that's the 25 to 54-year-olds, because of the one-child policy, that now begins to decline. So by 2030, these are UN population division figures, so the best quality we've got, that number is actually falling, which is quite astonishing. And again, what you're seeing here is the older generation is growing from 240-odd million up to 450. So even bigger growth. And of course, China has no social security network whatsoever. So this is an enormous challenge that, you know, something like a third of your population is going to be in that age group. The other thing that Hu and Wen obscured all the time with the assistance of people, well-meaning people like the Asian Development Bank, is China is not a middle-class country. What we know is the great achievement of Deng in his southern tour and Jiang was that they moved people up from below poverty level, less than $2, up to $10 income. And so the majority of the population now, around 80%, is earning around $10 or less. Only 20% is earning over that, and only 4%, and these are official numbers from the Asian Development Bank, they're not made up or anything, only 4% are earning over $20 a day. Now, that's $7,600 a year. You are not middle class if you are earning $7,600 living in London or anywhere else. So this is a kind of nonsense that people have put forward. Now, obviously there has been corruption, obviously there's been a black economy, but even if you double those numbers, it doesn't give you a middle class society. What it says is you need to focus on these people who are earning $2 to $10 in the rural area. And that is exactly what the new leadership has been talking about. So what does this mean for us? What it says is we need to start thinking about different age groups when we think, and financial incomes when we look at countries. So if we take the G20 is not a homogenous group. It's three groups, really. There is the rich but old, are those of us in the West. We've got a median age of somewhere around 40 to 45. I mean, Japan and Germany are at 45. So that, you know, the very old societies. US is 37. So it's, you know, we're all in that kind of age bracket, and we've got incomes of about $40,000 each. So we're pretty well off. We may not have saved enough and so on, but we, you know, if we're not completely stupid, we can make quite good things here. Then you've got the poor but young, the Saudis, the Indias, the South Africas, the Brazils. You know, median age is very much younger, 25 or so. Incomes also very much younger, around 10,000, so a quarter GDP per capita. And then you've got these two strange countries, poor but aging. China because of the one-child policy, Russia because of its lack of health policies and the alcohol and smoking problems that it has. So they've got the poverty, if you like, of the poor but young countries, but they've got the age profile of us. So they really do have immense challenges. Of course, they are incredibly important for the metals industry, which is why it's very important. You know, one of the justifications for talking about demographics here this morning. So where does this leave us? It's nice to think that the emerging economies can smoothly take over everything. If we slow down, it doesn't matter, they're a Rolls Royce they can pick up. But they can't. We in the West are 61%, nearly two-thirds of the global economy, even today. The BRICS are only 20%, and the others are less than that. So we've got a slowdown in two-thirds of the economy, which can't be compensated for by something else. But on the other hand, we have this great opportunity that there are all these 55-year-olds, and their numbers are growing. And if we started to think about what it is that they would like, then we could actually do quite nicely, as I say. Equally, we know that if you can start coming up with $50 refrigerators and $50 computers for people in rural areas, that will make an enormous difference to them. So there are opportunities here. It's not the end of the world for metals production by any means. Metals has survived worse than this. But what it means is we have to redirect. And this is what Michael Porter has said, probably one of the greatest management gurus of our time. You know, and if you just read this through, you know, I'm sure this all rings bells. You know, I worked for ICI, which was at one point the second largest chemical company in the world, and it was destroyed in the end over a sort of 10 or 20 year period by focusing on this commoditization of everything. And we lost sight of the longer term view, and we lost sight of the way in which we ought to be thinking 10 and 20 years ahead, rather than, oh my God, the FTSE's down a point, what should we do about it? As he says, companies have overlooked opportunities to meet fundamental societal needs. Our field of vision has simply been too narrow. Now, some very interesting examples, which I won't go into this morning, from companies like Unilever, from Procter & Gamble, from Nestle, who are recognising this and doing very well out of it. One example, in India, Unilever now get 10% of their revenue and profit from working in the rural villages. Interestingly also, the head of Unilever Europe pointed out the other day that they are now doing the same kind of sales effort in Spain, which was the 12th largest economy in the world, as they're doing in these countries. So Spanish women can now only afford to buy single sachets of soap. They can't buy a big packet and so on. So there's a lot of things going on, and we may be able to learn from some of the things that are going on in developing countries as well. Well, what this means is people have got less money. Therefore, this middle ground that we all occupied during the super cycle is disappearing. There will be a mass market. You can think Amazon, for example. Do everything at a very low margin. You know, Amazon spends billions of dollars to get a 2% margin. Fine, it does quite well. But so if you want to compete with Amazon, you also have to spend billions of dollars to get a 2% margin. Not a terribly attractive opportunity, I suggest. Instead, one needs to look at niches. And these niches can be quite large, and they can also be quite attractive. But the key is, for most of them, is affordability. Can people actually afford to do this? So I want to close then by saying this is really a critical moment, 2013. It is the moment when, just as in 1983, global growth took off when everybody was terribly pessimistic after the problems of the early 1980s. And suddenly we began to go to the sunlit uplands, as it were. We're now shifting in a new direction. I think anybody after 4 years who believes that stimulus programs will get us back to where we were before, or that China's demand is going to be the saviour, or indeed that the rise in oil price means end users demand it robust, I think they are indulging in wishful thinking. And I'm quite happy to have that discussion over coffee with anybody in the audience who does believe that. I see no evidence on the ground for any of those premises at all, and people who are in the middle at the moment seem to be suffering enormously while they wait for this revival to happen. On the other hand, what I see is that companies who are saying, okay, life is about change, we can cope with that, we've got bright people, we're talented, we can go and do this, are moving forward quite nicely. As I say, large companies as well as small, people like Unilever and Procter & Gamble. Mega trends around increasing food production, improving water availability, increasing life expectancy, reducing carbon footprint. All the things that you know about. These are the areas of real growth, I believe, for the future, and aligning them with the demographic drivers. So I'd leave you really with 6 questions. If we are going to have this period of low global growth, how will our P&L be impacted? Do we need to think about that? How does all the volatility that we see in pricing and demand patterns impact our key customers? Are we able to survive if some of them go out of business? You know, we are seeing in the chemicals industry, for example, which is normally a very good leading indicator of the economy, we are consistently seeing this quarter the worst quarter that any of us can remember in 20 or 30 years. There is absolutely no demand out there whatsoever because of the high oil price. So you know, a lot of very senior, very serious people in companies that I talk to around the world are saying Q2 could be very difficult indeed. So I think it's important that companies like your own start to think about, well, if this did get bad, how would we cope? What's our contingency plan if metals prices, instead of being at this new higher lower level, as it were, are now at support level, if they go back towards historical levels? What would that do? How would we cope with the working capital? Equally, how can we move forward here? How can we compete profitably either as a mass market player or a niche player? Can we create new offerings? And is there a potential to gain first mover advantage? There are challenges, there are opportunities. This is really why we have enormously talented, energetic people in the industry to move forward. So that was really what I wanted to say. I'll be delighted to talk to people afterwards on any or all of these subjects, and I hope we have a very interesting conference, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. Do we have any questions?
Yes, I didn't hear anything about impacts of for example, in the United States trying to legalize the illegal immigrants and encourage even more immigration. Those would, I would think, typically be younger on average than the demographic that you've been talking about today. What do you see as the impact of developing nations, citizens coming to more developed nations, UK, US? How do you see that playing into the scenario you've laid out?
I'm probably politically incorrect on this issue, but what I see is that if immigrants come to a country because they want to adopt the values and the attitudes of that country, they tend to do very well indeed. And if you look at, say, Caribbeans who came into the UK 20 or 30 years ago, and you look at their economic status today, it's indistinguishable from native Britons. So there's a process of acclimatization that can work very well. But I don't think this happens by accident. It's because those people want to be part of the society and because the society wants to have them. The downside of all this is if you look at the wages in the States, and the Bureau of Labour does publish these numbers, if you look at the differences between Asians, for example, and blacks, which they record, and Hispanics, what you see is that there's enormous disparity between wages. So Asians are at the top of the pile, from memory, about 120% of average spending, and Latinos and blacks are down at around 80%. So if you've got lots of Asians coming into the country, you've probably got a very vibrant, immediate contribution. If you've got lots of Mexicans and others coming into the country, you've got a bit of a challenge to absorb them and to get them moving up that scale. Now, I believe America can do it, I believe the UK can do it, but it's not a question of just, oh great, they can move us upwards. You actually probably have to invest in them short term in order to get the longer term benefit.
Any further questions? John?
Good morning, John Evans from Metal Pages. You mentioned that the metals industry has seen much worse in the past. I wonder if you could tell us when that was and what metal industry bosses or executives should be thinking about to combat the new trends that you were talking about.
Well, I think if you go back to the Depression era as an obvious time when demand for everything fell about. And that's why I can understand that policymakers are very worried about going back to a depression, and they see signs, it's just misleading that the signs they see of deflation are not due to a depression era activity. What I think, when I talk to company boards, well, the first thing is that I'm actually very encouraged over the last year that a number of major companies have invited me to come and talk to their boards, not just in Europe, but down in South Africa and elsewhere. And what I argue with them is it's better in these circumstances to be realistic. That you can put forward, if you like, for the press, this idea of, oh yes, it's all going to be okay, we think that next quarter will be brilliant, and so on. But if you kid yourselves that that's how it's going to be, you lose valuable time. What I also have seen in running workshops with senior management is that you can generate enormous energy once people recognise that there is something they can do about this. So if you're looking at mining in Africa, for example, there are skills there around running large projects in remote areas which in many cases don't even feature on a GPS map, which you can transfer very easily into other related projects. And I can't give you, for confidentiality reasons, details of those, but I can assure you that some very large and very sensible companies are moving forward in that direction.
Maybe if I could just make a comment or ask a question. The metal industry has benefited over the last 10 years particularly from China, but from strong global growth. We're now all asking ourselves what's going to come in the future. So what would your take be on global growth in general over the next 5 or 20 years?
I think, generally speaking, we will see negative growth in the West for the simple reason that people have moved in, too much of the population is now in the low spending age groups to survive. The only way if you wiped out everybody over 55, well then you could get back to good growth, but I'm not in favour of that, and I don't think you are, Nigel.
Probably not.
So, I think we will see much slower and much more volatile growth. I mean, if we look at China, which I've been looking at a lot in the last 3 or 4 months, I am actually quite encouraged by the new leadership. I'm one of those. I led ICI's business development activity in Asia from 1987 onwards, and so I was in the region an awful lot for 5 or 6 years at that time. And so I remember firsthand Jiang coming into power in '93. I remember Deng doing his southern tour, and so on. And Jiang, who has come back really came back in the summer and has installed. I view his people like Xi and Li, and most 6 of the 7 Politburo members, I think are part of his group. I have a lot of time for him. I think he sees very clearly what needs to be done. He's not afraid to have some dips on the way. If you like, where are we going to end up? I think, as Norman Lamont used to say here, if it's not hurting, it isn't working. And I suspect that some of the pain that we're going to see in China around a deflating property bubble, for example, around a change in direction from the cities, Shanghai, the growth of the cities and so on, into the rural areas. There was a program that's going on at the moment in Mongolia where they're aiming to move 500,000 herdsmen from the Mongolian steppes into a new city that's being built called Ordos. And the aim is to move their incomes up from $1 to $2 a day up perhaps to $5 or $10 a day by creating this new social structure and so on. Now this is pretty ambitious, but if it could work, that gives us an enormous opportunity. But I doubt it's all going to happen in a straight line. Some things will work and some things will fail.
I guess that one of the challenges for these big countries like China and India is whether the government can create a middle class that consumes lots of products that would take up some of the slack. Do you think that's likely?
No, they can't. Michael Spence, who got a Nobel Prize, pointed out that if you're a country like China or like Japan was or Korea, it takes 50 years of 7% growth consistently in order to reach middle class status. What happens is people have got overexcited, and every country has a middle income group. That's just mathematical. And people then, in order to make it all more exciting and appealing, say, oh, middle income means middle class. No, it doesn't, because middle class has a very specific meaning about a living standard and a level of education and everything which we are blessed with here in the West. And some countries have made it. If you look at Japan, Japan in 1975 or so was where China is today. So, and Korea and so on. So Japan and Korea started in 1950 and 1960, and by over 40 or 50 years, they reached Western levels. Tremendous success. So China can do that, but if 80% of your population is currently earning less than $10 a day, you've still got a long way to go. Another 20 years, it can get there. But that's, I wouldn't argue, Nigel, that you have to be middle class to sustain demand growth. What I'd say is the demand growth for people as they come into spending, the ability to spend, is fantastically important. So if you're earning $1 or $2 a day, you're below the poverty line, you're not part of the society. Now, you can afford a mobile phone. You can afford a can of Coke. You can afford to buy seeds. You can afford to buy fertilizer. Your decisions actually have an impact on your life. So that bracket is a tremendously exciting group of people to work with. And there's lots of opportunities there. They're just different from the ones, if I say to you here, Bill Gates is doing some terrific stuff in Africa in this area, funding whole areas which can make a real difference to people's lives and bring them into the world economy in a way that then creates further growth potential. So that it's tremendously challenging, and I'm optimistic about that. But it's wrong to see that a few wealthy people in Shanghai see them as being equivalent to the whole Chinese population, because they're not.